Hi guys, this is Bane, and sorry, this is less than ideal for me not to be here today since we're starting a project, but I figured kind of just making this recording and showing you kind of step by step how to start the project would be enough, and then tomorrow when I'm back we can kind of check in and make sure you're understanding. So I'm going to have a post up in the morning that is going to have a lot more with this poetry project and research. Um, if you remember today in class, the one thing I said was that by the end of class tomorrow being Thursday, I'd like you to have your poetic eras picked out. So it looks like we already have 3 groups formed, and I'd imagine just by the people that do not yet have a group formed, we have at least 2 more, if not 3. So just make sure if you are not one of the people listed with a group, that you comment on who you'd like to work with and your chosen poetic era. Since there's timestamps on these, I think it's only fair that each of the 3 groups that have already signed up, they have different poetic eras. So the remaining groups, these ones are off the table and you can choose from kind of what is left. There's lots of good stuff. So basically, to start out this project, this is the culmination of our entire 2-month study of poetry. So it's going to be about 200 points. You're going to want to click on this Poetry Project 2023. Like I said, tomorrow, by the time I update this, there'll be a lot more links and things on this post. But for this poetry project, it's really self-explanatory as far as what you're going to be doing. I tried to make it so. But it just says that the purpose of this project is to help you go through and put into practice all the skills we've been working on reading and analyzing poetry. So this is the order of your tasks. I tried to make it really simple. So it can be divided into 2 parts, a research and a presentation. During the research part, once you've chosen your selected poetic era, so for example, one of the groups chose the confessional poets, the first thing I'm going to have you do is look a little bit into this poetic era. So the underneath define the poetic literary era, there are a number of questions. There's also going to be this sheet attached that I will have you and your group complete, and it's basically you just getting an idea of what was going on in this chronology of poetry. So a simple Google search will yield answers to any of these questions. So again, going back to the example of the confessionals, what's the definition of the time period and era? If you Google what is confessional poetry, you'll get a lot of information. For the next box down, the relevant historical information, what I'm looking for there is, well, if this era was in the 1950s and it was predominantly American poets, what are some of the things that were relevant happening in America during this time that may or may not have influenced the direction that these poets chose to go? Significant poets, I've given you some, but I'd like you to also stretch out and see who else would be included in this genre. The characteristics of their poetry, again, a simple Google search. And then what I'd also like you to do is look at the previous era. So what type of poetry came before this, and then the era to follow. What kind of poetry came after this? And that's because they all kind of grew either as kind of a support of the group that came before it, or kind of an opposition to the group that came before it. And then the last thing down here, wherever you consulted your sources, just give me the URL. I did say at the bottom that the Poetry Foundation page must be one of your sources if that's applicable, and I would say in almost every case it is. All right, so going back to where am I going to get some of this information? If you scroll down, I guess one of the most important things is once you have your poetry choice, if you see here we've got the confessionals, one of the groups that would precede it would be the Victorians. There's a couple groups that I cut out that used to be on here. I don't think they're on here anymore. They're on an earlier draft. But you can look on like a poetry timeline. You're going to tell me about who came before and after. But like I also said, you've got on here one of the characteristics of the confessional poets, vivid self-revelation. So that could go in your poetic info sheet. You could also obviously find a lot more about that. And then I've given for every group, I think I tried to give at least 4 poets that were featured. So step 1 for this poetry project is, once you've picked a group of poets, start your research. So step 1 is define the poetic literary era. Step 2, identify significant poets. As you're looking through and finding out information about this poetic era, you're going to come up with a lot more poets. So I'd like you to figure out who those are. And then I think like a good stopping point, I would be surprised if anybody got past step 3 tomorrow. I want you to read widely from that poetic era. So I tried to give you a small sampling in class of each of the different types of major poetic eras. We did modernism, we did confessionals, we did a romantic poem, we did a Victorian poem. So I want you to read widely. And if you see here, the magic number is 20. So once you kind of narrow down some of these really significant poets, I want you to read their poetry. So you've had experience with one Sylvia Plath poem. If I was the confessional poets, I would read at least 2 or 3 more of Plath's work. If not, more than that, if you decide that you really kind of like her stuff. And part of that is just to get a better scope of what kind of work was produced during this time period. So this is all part of the research phase. And since it is part of a research phase, I'll kind of pause here in my explanation, but I'll just say that you need to be keeping track of your sources. So not only on this poetic era info sheet, but what we're ultimately kind of leading towards is, you'll see number 4 on here under research, is you're going to create a reference. You guys are going to be making an annotated bibliography. So if I am going to have the confessional poets as my kind of project, you're going to be creating essentially an annotated bibliography. Is a works cited page that has a little annotation underneath, or a little kind of summary. So this is an example on my screen right now of an annotated bibliography. I just found this. It was something that I guess like a group of poets did, and they created an annotated bibliography on poetry of the plains. So you'll see here that they've got, here's the citation, and then underneath is a brief annotation. And it says on the assignment sheet back here, you'll follow the MLA Summarize Evaluate template. So in other words, your annotation will summarize what the source was and your evaluation of it. So these don't have to be super long. They can be, I think usually 100 words is like a good area to live in. I would not pass that up, especially when, if I'm going to be having you read 20 poems by the poets from your era, those poems are all going to go on this bibliography. So, an evaluation might be, this is one way that this poem fits this poetic era, and then a summary might be, this is Sylvia Plath's poem about her father and some of the issues she had with him, da-da-da-da-da-da. So this is how you are going to create your annotated bibliography. That brings us kind of to the research portion of this project. So one of your big assignments that you'll get evaluated on is that annotated bibliography. The second thing is you're going to narrow down 3 poems in particular that you really like that are examples from this era. And once you get to those 3 poems, I'm going to have you complete one of these more in-depth explications. So again, going back to the confessionals, if you decide 3 Sylvia Plath poems are the ones that you want to focus in on, you're going to do a TP cast for each of those poems. And then you're going to go through and you're going to look at it at that, what we've been calling the molecular level. What can you tell me about the structure, the language, and the sound of your poem? And then statement of meaning. So you're only doing that for 3 poems out of your chosen era. And then, I guess this was an example I was going to show you of a poetic era information sheet. Moving on through this, you'll annotate those 3 poems. You'll do a note sheet for each of those poems, and then you're going to present your poetic era. So this is one that I had from a couple of years ago. Maybe this was even last year. I'm not really sure. But this was the modernist group. Yeah, this was last year. So they talk about in their presentation, what is the modernist era? What are some different historical context? What are characteristics? And then for the one poem that they decided to teach to the class, they picked W.H. Auden. And then they talked about his poetry. And then they focused in on explaining and explicating this one poem for us. So this is your your 2 examples of how you're going to earn your 200 points for the end of this unit. Again, you've got this annotated bibliography and you've got this presentation that you are going to do to teach the class. Now, to give a little bit more buy-in to the presentations, there is going to be one final bit of writing for this, and that is at the end of these presentations, I will choose one of the poems that's been presented and we will do a timed write in class based on the AP rubric where we will use that poem. So it's going to be beneficial to be paying attention during these because then you're going to get a lot of background about the poem that will make that in-class timed write better. So you know me, because I'm not short-winded, at the end of this document I've got, here are your final 2 products, the annotated bibliography and the presentation. So this should be a good enough start for you guys to get going on this project. Like I said, the step after choosing your genre and your group is going to be start looking into the poetic era, start looking at particular poets. And then I just had this search bar open for the Poetry Foundation because once you do kind of find some poets that you think you want to focus in on, or if they're on my list, I've been talking about the confessionals. So let me use Sylvia Plath as an example. Poetry Foundation is a really good place to start. Not only do they have biographical information about the author, or the poet, but once you click on the poet, you'll be able to find a link on the sidebar that says see all poems by Sylvia Plath, and then there's just a ton that will come up. We'll also be going down to the media center at certain points so that you guys can look at specific books, because sometimes it's just easier to read poetry when you're reading it out of a book. So I'm going to stop here, but if you have any questions, feel free to email me.